Hello everyone, nice to see you here. My name is Edvin. I'm your guide for the next 25 minutes. Just a very quick disclaimer. I haven't done this for quite some time. So if you don't understand anything, if there's something I don't explain clear enough, please just ask me, okay? Wonderful. And of course, if you have any just questions, anything on your mind, just please raise your hand and I'll try to answer them, okay? Perfect. Then let's start. As you might have noticed, behind me, we have this wonderful ship. Her name is Vasa. Perhaps the biggest failure in the history of modern Sweden. Here she is. In order to understand this big and astonishing ship, it's crucial to understand the time in which she was built. That was the 17th century. That was, in Europe at least, a time of great contrasts. On the one hand, there were the rich elite, people with a lot of money and power. They enjoyed a mixture of art and partying at this time. On the other hand though, there were poor majority. The people that really didn't have the high standards of living that the elite did. They made out about 95% of the population in Sweden at this time. And they were plagued by poverty and by illnesses. They generally didn't have a good time. But even if the Swedish society was incredibly separated, it was very different how one lived, farmers or the rich elite. Sweden as a country still made some progression in terms of not inventing, but we basically got the freedom of press and we figured out how to run a government. So there were some progressions from this century as well. But Sweden at this time, as a country, wasn't the Sweden we know today. Big parts of modern day southern Sweden, they belonged to our arch enemy Denmark, while Finland belonged to Sweden. So that meant the Baltic Sea was in the middle of the country, which meant ships were incredibly important. And Sweden had, as the Vasa was being built, recently seen a new king being crowned, Gustav II Adolf. He was very ambitious and he fought hard to expand Swedish territory. In other words, he liked going to war. As a matter of fact, Sweden was often at war during the 17th century. If you had to take a guess, how many out of the 100 years would you guess that Sweden was at war for this century? What would you guess? Any guesses? 100?
200.
200? 80? Pretty close. 96. We enjoyed peace for an astonishing 4 years in an entire century. Quite a stark contrast to today, where we haven't been to war for over 200 years. So there was this new king being crowned, Gustav II Adolf, and he also had a great enemy. His name was King Sigismund of Poland. Sigismund was actually the king of Sweden before Gustav II Adolf became king of Sweden. And Sigismund really hadn't gotten over that he had lost the throne. And so he took Poland to war against Sweden for the Swedish throne. It was an incredibly important war for the Swedish king. And so that leads us on to the Vasa. This is where she comes in. Because there were two main goals the Swedish king, Gustav II Adolf, aimed at accomplishing when building this ship. First one being actually building an astonishing ship, building an impressive ship, a ship worth showing off. As you heard, 95% of the population in Sweden were farmers. Farmers, as I mentioned, during this time, they paid a lot of taxes. And actually every 10th young man in the entire country was sent out into the many wars that Sweden fought during this century. And so the farmers in Sweden had sacrificed so much, their money, but of course, first and foremost, their sons. The Swedish state, the Swedish king needed something to show the farmers, something concrete. Because at this time, there was no internet. There were almost no books. There were almost no newspapers. When you paid your taxes or you sent your son out into the war, you never heard of him again. And you never got to see your money again. This ship was meant to be something concrete, something the population in Sweden could see and go, wow, I've contributed to all of this. Because before Vasa, there was almost nothing. And you have to admit that this goal was accomplished. She is very, very impressive. Even more impressive when you consider she was built from scratch 400 years ago without the modern day tools and technologies we have. So the first goal of the Vasa, accomplished. The second goal of the Vasa, that was to build a ship that could fight Poland. Basically a warship. And she was a real warship. She had space for 72 guns, 450 people. She was, in fact, the most heavily armed ship in northern, possibly even all of Europe at the time. It's quite impressive for a small country like Sweden. And I mean, she probably would have helped Sweden in the war against Poland if she wouldn't have sunk after about 30 minutes in the Stockholm harbor. So unfortunately, the second goal of the Vasa, to help Sweden in the war against Poland, was not accomplished by any means whatsoever. That was a bit about the history of Sweden and about the goals of the Vasa. Now we're gonna move up to the 5th floor. If you want to take the elevator, just press the 5. Otherwise, we're gonna take the stairs. Please follow me. Now, as we've moved up 1 floor, we get another view of the Vasa. In fact, from here, we can look right into her through the gun ports. Everything in this ship that you see that is dark brown or black or something in between is original. Original wood from the 17th century, 400-year-old wood. Everything that you see that's light brown, that's not original. That's been added to give you an idea of how she would have looked. For example, the ropes, the rigging, it's not original. But almost everything else is original. 98% of the entire ship is original. Everything in here, almost except the fire extinguisher, I guess. I guess that wasn't invented by then. Now we get to the fun stuff. On the 10th of August in the year 1628, it was finally time for the Swedish Navy's biggest ever ship, the Vasa, to set sail and go out on her maiden voyage. She had been publicly built in Stockholm for the past 2.5 years. And it was actually the largest work site in the entire city at the time. Stockholm, the capital of Sweden, had about 10,000 people living here. And about 400 people worked with or on this ship. That meant every 25th person in the entire city worked on this ship. Stockholm today has a population of about 2 million people. A 25th of that would be a very, very large amount. So it was a very big project for the Swedish state. And hence, we believe there was a great public interest on this Sunday afternoon, as the Vasa was supposed to first set sail and go out on a maiden voyage. She was built not far away from here, and they actually aimed at sending the sails at first, but then they realized there wasn't enough wind at the moment, so she had to be dragged for a few hundred meters until modern day Slussen, where they finally could feel some wind, and then they set 4 of the 10 sails on the Vasa, and she could begin her maiden voyage. But first of all, salute had to be fired in honor of the king. But he wasn't on board, luckily enough. He wasn't standing on the shore. He wasn't in Stockholm. In fact, he wasn't even in Sweden. He was elsewhere and very busy with the war against Poland. But still, he was the king. He had ordered the Vasa to be built. Salute had to be fired from all of the 72 guns. I also mentioned that it was a Sunday. That's very central to this story. Sundays in Sweden 400 years ago, everyone went to church. After church, you were free to do whatever you liked. It was a public holiday, Sundays in Sweden. And as you might have realized, Stockholm is a city of islands. There is a lot of water here. That means there are also a lot of boats. That was the case 400 years ago as well. If you had some spare time on your hands, which almost everyone in the city on this Sunday afternoon had, and you owned a boat, it's likely you followed the Vasa on the water. So, salute had just been fired. There were a lot of small boats around the Vasa. She began her maiden voyage for real. And everything went quite smoothly for an entire 15 minutes. Then, a small gust of wind came. The 4 set sails of the Vasa, they, of course, caught this small gust of wind, and she began to lean heavily to port. She stayed there for a couple of seconds, and she could slowly righten herself up and sail on. The Vasa, the biggest and the best ship that the Swedish Navy had ever built, had survived her first small gust of wind. Yeah, of course, that was kind of her goal. She was supposed to survive a small gust of wind in the Stockholm harbor on a mild Sunday afternoon. She wasn't, though, supposed to lean that heavily to port after such a small gust of wind. Everyone in the crew knew after this first gust of wind that something wasn't quite right. And they were very much correct in thinking that, because 15 minutes after the first gust of wind, 30 minutes after they had first set sail, another gust of wind caught the sails of the Vasa. And she began to lean heavily to port once again, this time a bit stronger. Maybe you paid great attention and you remember that salute was fired through all of the 72 gun ports. In order to fire salute, the guns have to be rolled out, and in order for the guns to be rolled out, the gun ports have to be opened. The gun ports closest to the waterline were about 1.3 meters above it. As the Vasa was leaning heavily to port that second time, she was leaning so heavily that the water could just rush through the gun ports. And she sank, quite frankly. There's no other way in putting it. She just sank. After having sailed for about 30 minutes, she came about a kilometer, and in the Stockholm harbor, she just sank. Of course, quite embarrassing, that must be said. Questions had to be asked. First of all, how could this happen? Second of all, who is responsible? And third of all, exactly why did she sink? Back then, actually the most important question was, who's responsible? And so they had a great hearing, and after a month or two after she'd sunk, they came to the very unofficial conclusion that the ship constructor was at fault for this. That's not too far-fetched, actually. That's pretty correct. But the thing is, he was chosen, he was blamed for this because they knew he wouldn't defend himself. He didn't. Ooh. Everything okay?
Yeah.
Wonderful. He didn't defend himself. He couldn't defend himself. He died a year before the Vasa even first set sail. He was the only one, realistically, that they could realistically blame for this, that was dead. And since everyone involved had a small piece of that blame cake, they just decided to blame everything on this ship constructor. So it was a win-win. Today though, the question we find important is the question of why she sank. Back then, a certain Isaac Newton had been around, and he hadn't discovered those or come up with those mathematical tools to calculate balance and stability and stuff. But today, luckily enough, he's been around, and we've calculated, and the Vasa was not supposed to set sail on that Sunday afternoon. She has a very, very high point of gravity. Means there is just way too much weight too far up in the ship. This causes her to be very unstable. If I were to balance this flashlight on a table or something, it would stand pretty well until I would blow it, or I would just push it, it would just fall. And this is the case with the Vasa as well. As long as they're constant and low wind, she's perfectly fine. But when there comes a small gust of wind or two, she had no chance. She probably would have survived the second gust of wind if the gun ports would have been closed, but she would never stood a chance in a storm or even in a war. And there are a number of reasons for this high point of gravity. The first and the most important one is the width of the ship. In fact, the Vasa had a sister ship. Her name was the Apple. You might have heard, they just 2 weeks ago, they found her in the Stockholm harbor after about 400 years. So that's very exciting. Anyways, the Apple and the Vasa were basically identical to each other, but with one major difference, and that was the width. The Apple was 1 meter wider than the Vasa. Same length, same height, same number of gun decks, too. 1 meter in the width. The Apple survived for about 30 years, Vasa for about 30 minutes. It's hard to grasp that just a meter would make such a big difference. But that's the truth. The second reason, that's the reason we're standing on this level actually. We're looking into the ship, into the second gun deck, the upper gun deck. And this upper gun deck, there is a copy of it actually on the 5th level as well, but on the other side of the ship. I'd recommend you to go over there. In there, I can walk around. No problem. And that's a problem. because I'm about 15 centimeters, about 6 inches taller than the average height for a male in Sweden in the 17th century, and I'm average height for a male today in Sweden. Basically, they should have saved a lot of wood, maybe 10, 15 centimeters around the entire ship. And that would have made a huge difference as well. In addition to all of this, the Swedish king, if you remember him, Gustav II Adolf, he ordered the guns on both the gun decks to be the same. Standard this time was that the guns on the upper gun deck were a bit lighter than the guns on the lower gun deck, which honestly just makes sense. I don't know why he wanted the guns to be of the same size and of the same weight, but the fact is that in the 17th century, when a king says it's supposed to be this way, the guns were of the same height, of the same weight. And so of course that made a difference, but the king was not to blame. The Vasa is quite impressive for a number of reasons, but the fact still remains, she's a failure. It's easy for us to stand here and think that it's pretty stupid to build a ship, not even that can't even sail. But you do have to remember that even though we know a lot more, we still, everything we build or our projects, they don't always work either. They invested a lot of money and a lot of time into this ship, and it didn't work. Same goes for us. Maybe you've heard of the other ship that sank about 300 years after the Vasa. Yes, due to other reasons, of course. But still, the Titanic was built with a lot more knowledge, a lot more technology, and she still sank on her maiden voyage. So that's important to remember. We can laugh at them, they would have laughed at us, I'm sure. Now, if I were to speak for about 5 more minutes, you would get a pretty good idea of how long the Vasa sailed. About 30 minutes. Unfortunately, I'm not gonna do that. We've reached the end of this guided tour. I hope you learned something new or found this interesting. I wish you a continued pleasant day here at the museum and also in my beautiful city, Stockholm. Thank you very much for your very kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you.
To capture it and plunder. So he sails towards the coastline of Italy. He sees this town with large walls. He pretends that he is a Christian, that he is about to die, and he wants a burial inside of the cathedral of the city. So he's granted the permission, and right about when they're going to put his coffin down into the crypt, the lid pops up open. He jumps out of it with his sword and he starts to kill people.
Is that sword a real sword?
Yes, it's a real sword.
Is that thing?
It's a real thing. So he starts to kill everyone, and then he captures the city. Then he captures the city and he goes like, "I, Bjorn Ironside, I have captured the city of Rome." And the people went like, "This is not Rome, this is Luna." And anyone heard of City of Luna? Have you heard of City of Luna? No? Even Italians don't know about City of Luna. So Bjorn Ironside got really mad about this, and then he killed everyone there and then left. So yeah, Vikings. What you can do about it? Right, now second question I have for you. I would like to know what kind of image comes up to your mind when I say the word Viking. How do you picture us Vikings?
A person like you with beard and then like
Bored. Cute. Cute Vikings. Cute and bored Vikings. Scary Vikings. Vikings, huh?
No. And naughty. Disgusting. And unkind. Oh, that is really
Okay. Now let's see the adults what they think about the Vikings.
They think nothing. Oh.
Strong.
Adult.
Strong. Strong, naughty Vikings. What else?
Disgusting.
Brave. Yeah, it takes lots of courage to sail across the seas when you don't know where you're going. Huh? GPS and maps don't exist that back then. What else?
Yes.
Brave, strong, naughty.
Unkind.
Axe and helmet. Helmet has a horns on it. How many of you picture a Viking wearing a helmet with the horns? Yeah? Okay, we have to fix that then.
With that metal jacket also, like.
The chainmails.
Yes.
Okay, cool. I will try to fit it into the story. Right, let's start with the boring part, the history. The Viking Age has begun in the year 793 on 8th of June, 11 a.m. What
You
makes...
know, we learned it in school.
Uh-huh.
In Fisk, Russia, Poland.
Would make sense to start the Viking Age at 11 a.m. Tom. So 793 is very bad year for England. The monks have written in their historical records that there were diseases and famine and people were dying. Some people have seen crazy stuff. They have seen dragons in the storm clouds over the sea.
Viking is crazy.
No, that's English people that were. No, English people is as crazy as Vikings.
Because Vikings thinking that they're selfish because they only want their food and their land, and even they die, they could go to the sky and do a party, and that's a big deal.
I present you. And you know what
So what?
8th of June, though, is even worse day for the Englishman. There is an island called Lindisfarne Island on the east coast of England. And on 8th of June, monks from the monastery windows saw the Viking ship approach the shore, and then they jumped out of the boat and they charged towards monastery. And then you all know what we Vikings used to do with monasteries,
I
right?
have a question.
Later. We killed some monks, we take some monks as the slaves, we took all their treasure, then we ate their lunch. Because the Vikings were into international cuisine, you see. And after that we just left to Scandinavia, very happy about these doings. Now, when historians began to study Viking Age 800 years later, in 16th century, they looked into historical records because archaeology back then was really not advanced, you know. So they started to look for written sources, and they saw that this mention of the Vikings was the very first time that somebody writes about meeting Scandinavians in that context. And historians suppose that Viking Age must have begun in 793, 8th of June. Even though archaeologists nowadays would like to push the date a little bit back, about 50 years earlier, because we have strong archaeological evidence that before we plunder in England, we start to settle on the islands like Shetland Islands, Orkney Islands, Faroe Islands, all those little islands around the place. Can I ask you please to, you guys go in front here and so leave the space on the stairs?
I still have a question.
Yes, we do the questions after the tour. Okay?
What?
Let me please talk. I have lots of stuff to tell and very short time to talk. Now, so, how did the history of the Viking Age was studied? Historians look in the written sources, and we have 3 of them. The first of them was made by us, Vikings, here in Scandinavia. Does anyone know where did we leave our inscriptions? Anyone?
What?
Where do Vikings write their things?
Your left.
No, what object? Stones! Rune stones! We have made over 3,200 rune stones, of which we know because many have been destroyed. Rune stones are big stones where you chisel out your messages. Now, unfortunately, rune stones are kind of not a very good source of historical information. The most typical image that you will find on the text that you will find on the runestone will say something like this. This runestone has been made by Olaf in the name of his father Torbjörn, who was a good man. May the god protect his soul. First of all, we know that Torbjörn died and Olaf has inherited his properties and now he's owner here. And he's a Christian. Most of the runestones are Christian. And these are trending runestones to make due to church becomes very strong in 10th century around this area and starts to take away lands from people. So what we are doing is we're marking our territory. This is my land, I'm Christian, I have no quarrel with the church. Please let it be my land. Some runestones do speak about historical events, but if you look at a runestone, you will understand that it can't contain too much information because it's just a big boulder. It's not a book with 1,000 pages. So instead of writing, today I woke up inspired of doing great deeds, gathered 20 warriors and prepared my vessel for expedition to the west. The weather was just, no, you skip all that, you go like, I go England. And some snakes on it because artwork is very important. Now, so some runestones are even actually more unique than that. One of them, my favorite one, you will find in Sigtuna, about 40 minutes away from here. First Christian village of the Vikings and the first capital city of Swedish kingdom after Viking Age was over. And the runestone has inscription there that says, this runestone has been made by Anan for himself in his own memory. Historically very important information. Now we know that some Vikings were deeply in love with themselves. Now other runic inscriptions are made on the stones, but they're not rune stones, nevertheless they're quite famous. One of them you will find in Istanbul. Has anyone been to Istanbul? Yeah? Have you been to Hagia Sophia? The mosque, the big mosque that used to be Christian cathedral, right? It's amazing, it's impressive. 1,000 years ago, a Viking man walked into it and he was so impressed by it that he had to leave a message for future generations. He pulled out his carving knife and he carved out on one of the walls, "Halfdan was here." He started the trend we still follow, but now there's a public bathroom. So please don't desecrate our bathroom there. Huh? So runestones are not really good source of information about historical events, especially in 16th century. And that's why historians look somewhere else and they found the second source. And those are Icelandic sagas. Those are over 700 stories that talk about the myths and the gods and legendary heroes and the brave shield maidens. So good. But we have one big problem about Icelandic sagas. Those were written down in 13th century and the Viking Age finished in 11th. Yeah? That's 200 years later. This story's been traveling from mouth to mouth because non-important stuff which is allowed in the stones for 1,000 years later, people be able to read them. The important stuff we pass on the way in the form of gossip. I heard about these kings that did this. Huh? So when we study Icelandic sagas, we see that there is a big gap of the time. Because of the time we have lost some of the information, the details changed. Huh? And that's why historians start to look somewhere else and they found the third most prominent, most detailed source on which they based all their research. That source was made by people who have met us Vikings at some stage, somewhere. Unfortunately, most of these meetings haven't been too nice. Now, 1,000 years ago, who knows how to write in Europe? What people? What kind of people write? Monks, exactly. Church does not like the common people to know how to write and read because it's too much of the power. So monks are the ones who write. And monks are quite easy to impress. You just go like, "Woo!" And they're like, "Santa Madre Cristo, por favor, Santa Virgen." And they live in a monastery full of treasures, the favorite destination for the real Vikings. Now, who are the real Vikings?
You.
After all the research that we have done, we know for sure two things. The word Viking does exist back in the Viking Age, but it is a profession. And it's actually, the word itself implies going on piracy raid. So I'm not a Viking, I go on Viking. Thus, I become a Viking. And what we know is that only about 10% of us would ever engage in the Viking raids. Most of the people live kind of a boring life back here at home. People who would create a functional society, farmers, artisans, traders, simple people. It doesn't matter how much silver you bring back from Hans in England. If you don't have a food here, you will starve. Huh? And thus, majority of us has been not mentioned in the history, and only the big Vikings, scary Vikings, have been in the focus of the historians. Now I would like you to follow me into the museum and meet a man who lived here 1,000 years ago. Done nothing in his life, but let's see what he has to tell us about it. Let's go. And behave, young people.
pense que ce sera la flotte.